In my Scott Cawthon video, I outlined the following principle, and since we're going to be using it again today, it's probably a good idea to dig into it a bit more deeply. I mentioned that if you had an immutable characteristic that you publicly identified with, you could experience bigotry for it. For example, if you outwardly identified as a gay man, and you had the immutable characteristic of being gay, you might face homophobia from some people. To anybody who is liberal-minded, to anybody who values fairness as a principle, this isn't right. It makes no sense to hold somebody back in life for something that they cannot help and cannot change. That seems simple enough, right? That was the backbone of gay marriage activism, back when that was still a relevant social issue. You know, being born that way. I still believe this to be fundamentally true, but when you poison this equation with intersectionality, when you replace the fairness of liberalism with the equity of progressivism, we can watch in real time this formulation crumble away. The liberal conception of bigotry requires both components to be real homophobia, the identity and the immutable characteristic. That should seem obvious. For example, if you're a closeted gay man, and let's say that you're closeted enough that others can't really tell that you're gay, if you have the immutable characteristic of being gay, but not that public persona, you're not actually going to experience homophobia, at least not directed at you. There are, of course, also instances where you cannot actually conceal the identity. For example, you can't be a closeted black man. You're always going to have that outward signifier due to your skin color. The legitimate racism that black people face comes from the public identification of their blackness, plus the immutable characteristic that is their ethnicity. What progressives began to notice, however, is that people who had the identity, but not the immutable characteristic, could also experience something that, on the surface, seemed like bigotry. Let's assume a man who isn't actually gay at all. He lacks the immutable characteristic of being gay, but he outwardly presents as very feminine and camp, and, stereotypically gay, even though he's not. If that individual were to be placed in a social situation where a gay person might experience homophobia, he too would be given shit for his outward behaviors by those same people. However, where the progressives went wrong was in assuming that this negativity was actually homophobia, of the exact same stripe that a legitimately gay man would face. However, it's not. After all, he's not actually gay. Maybe it's anti-male sentiment. Maybe it's anti-femboy sentiment. Though I can see why the progs, for political reasons, would not want to admit that those two forms of bigotry actually exist. Maybe it's not bigotry at all. Maybe they're just making fun of him for being a wimp. Maybe he actually does need to toughen up a little bit. Maybe not. Who knows? But the point is, within the liberal framework we're talking about here, this isn't homophobia because there's no actual gay people involved. By the way, this is why I think two white people who jokingly say the N-word to each other aren't actually racist, because I don't believe language is a magic spell that you cast to make the universe incrementally better or worse. However, if we accept the progressive framework rather than the liberal one on this issue, if we were to actually believe that the feminine guy getting flack for being feminine is somehow actually homophobia, and not simply anti-male or anti-femme or just people being assholes, then it logically follows that in order to experience bigotry, you don't actually need the immutable characteristic, only the identity. You don't need to be gay to experience homophobia. And what logically follows from that is people demanding all of their identities be respected as valid, all the way down to mental illnesses or associations with fandoms and subcultures, and yes, transracialism. And even if there's a possibility that the person is just faking it for clout, like I brought up in my Demi Lovato video. There's a big story recently about Ollie London transitioning their race to become Korean. This was covered by Hasan, who hilariously had no argument against it.
Aren't you making a bad argument? Then if it can be destroyed by this, there is no good argument against it, unfortunately. If you believe that every experience is fucking valid unconditionally, then you have to acknowledge that Ollie London has neo-pronouns ko and rian, and they're actually a Korean and maybe even Jimin.
It was also covered by Sargon and PewDiePie and others too. But I think everybody's missing a crucial component of the conversation here. That component is the difference between the liberal and progressive conceptions of bigotry. This logic applies to other transracial people as well, from Sean King to Rachel Dolezal. The progressives find themselves without any convincing arguments against transracialism because they have already expelled the immutable characteristic from the bigotry equation. If it really is all just identification, then however you identify must inherently be valid, no matter what it is you're identifying as. By the way, this is the core of the attack helicopter joke from years and years ago. I'm glad progressives are finally beginning to catch on to this logic.
There are definitely ultra woke people that identify this way. I know a few that say their response to the attack helicopter meme should just be the respect the person's attack helicopter identity. Yeah, extremely online weirdos, dude. Okay. Yeah, that's insane. Sorry. Like, you're not a fucking attack helicopter, and Ollie London is not Korean.
I remember at one point speaking to Lilith about her own transgenderism, and she colloquially defined it as I think I'm a girl and I can't stop. There's two important takeaways from that. One is that she's appealing to an immutable characteristic, that she cannot help but be trans. It doesn't matter if in some alternate timeline she decided to not transition and instead outwardly appearing to be hypermasculine. She would always be this way inside her own head. She would always be closeted. And two, naturally following from one, she recognizes that she thinks she is a woman. Not that she's actually biologically female and therefore sex doesn't exist and all this other nonsense. Lilith understands that she has gender dysphoria, that it is a mental disorder, and that her being afflicted with it is the grounds that makes her treatment of it legitimate. Part of that treatment is transitioning. Part of that treatment is surrounding herself with people who accept her identity. But she also understands that some people just won't do that. They have the right not to, and she has the right not to associate with them. This is what makes transgenderism valid within a liberal framework. The understanding that it's not simply a matter of identity, but that it has an immutable medical component. And that transitioning is not simply living your best life or being accepted for who you are deep down. It's medical treatment. Progressives fundamentally reject this liberal argument as transmedicalism. The transmedicalist is somebody who believes that being transgender is contingent on experiencing gender dysphoria, and that people who identify as transgender but don't experience gender dysphoria and have no desire to transition are not truly transgender. Progressives often deride transmedicalists as true scum, which stands for true transsexual scum, referring to the practice of gatekeeping transness to people who actually experience gender dysphoria. The progressives also contrast true scum with too cute, standing for too cute to be cisgender. Yes, I know that neither of these terms are acronyms. I never said this shit made any sense. The point is, there is a massive split between the trans people who genuinely cannot help but be trans, and the trans people who believe that they are trans based solely on their identity as such. Liberal versus progressive. Transmedicalist versus transtrender. Immutable characteristic versus identity. It should be no surprise to you which side I fall on. When Hasan spoke out against Ollie London's transracialism on the grounds of it lacking an immutable characteristic, his own chat room rebelled against him, bringing up the specter of transmedicalism.
Dysphoria is not a requirement as the transmedicalist opinion. I know it's not a requirement, but there is no way you can make this fucking argument, dude. Would you like to make this argument? Then go ahead. I want to have like, this destroys, here, you want to know what it is? You want to know why this is like really fucking annoying to me? Unfortunately, if you're looking for me to like absolutely obliterate this point of view, I can't, because people like this literally destroy this argument. And people like you in the chat who fucking turn around and advocate for certain things literally also help this argument craft. You get that, right? Like, you want everything to be a valid concept. And if that's your fucking point of view, then yeah, people like Ollie London are going to shatter that. And just because dysphoria is not a requirement to be trans does not mean that like it is a legitimate thing that has been well documented throughout time and makes up a pretty sizable chunk of trans people's existences. That doesn't make you a transmedicalist to recognize that.
And if you're a progressive who already expelled the legitimacy of immutable characteristics from your moral framework, then you have no leg to stand on when it comes to transracial people. Progressives have to fall back on liberal positions to object to this shit. Like I said, this is an older phenomenon than just Ollie London. Other people have been doing this for a while now. This is an article from 2019 complaining about Rachel Dolezal, titled "Transracial is not the new transgender." How do you think these people square their objection to it? Unlike gender, which is assigned to you at birth, your race or ethnicity is rooted in ancestry. You can't inherit your gender, but you do inherit your race. The fact that these people believe that they can pick and choose parts of their ethnicity they want, and later decide to revert to their whiteness, is white privilege at its worst. Oh look, it's an appeal to immutable characteristics. Of course, the truth is you do actually inherit both your biological sex, and in many cases your gender identity, from your parents, because we are not purely socially constructed beings. Here's the real kicker though. Progressives actually do believe in transracialism, but only when it benefits their politics. Here's a viral Twitter thread from last year. If you look white, you're white. The concept of race is based on appearance, so your outward-facing identity, not your immutable characteristics. So yeah, you're white and you need to face that. Yes, you can still be ethnically and culturally part of a non-white culture, but you are still white. Check your privilege and use it for good. Maybe sometimes you're seen as white, but sometimes you're not. Yet the mere fact that you can be seen as white at all is a privilege itself. You can still be white and indigenous. You can be white and have parents or siblings who are visibly non-white. It doesn't cancel out your hardships. Intersectionality will always be a thing. Don't come into my mentions telling me about how your struggles as a white passing person overshadow mine as a very visible Asian person. I respect and encourage you to stay connected with your non-white culture, but don't act like you know what it's like to be an actual person of color. When the transracialism involves a white person transitioning to be another race, it's invalid, it's blackface, it's whitey avoiding responsibility for their colonizing past. But when the transracialism involves a non-white person looking more white than they actually are, these activists are willing to completely expel people into the white race based on colorism alone. If you're a black person who is white passing, you ain't black, I guess. It's almost as if non-white racial identities are cherished and protected as something exclusive by these people. As a side note, it will always be weird to me to watch progressives fall back on the one-drop rule in order to justify their strict ethnic segregationism, despite completely avoiding biology as they abolish gender segregationism. The separate but equal doctrine in American law was enshrined by the Plessy versus Ferguson lawsuit in 1896. Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black, and therefore legally considered to be a black man because American law cared about race in that way at that time, and despite appearing entirely white, was forced out of the first-class carriage of a train back into the colored carriage, despite having a first-class ticket. Over 100 years later, people similarly complain about pretendians, like Elizabeth Warren, who use some distant Native American ancestry to gain advantages, despite being almost entirely white. Both are bigotry, both are unfair, both are fundamentally anti-liberal. We can object to this stuff because our formulation of bigotry is still intact. It's not just how you identify, it's also your immutable characteristics that determines legitimate bigotry. In removing the immutable characteristics from their arguments, progressives have no reply to any of this. And if that's the case, there is no argument against stuff like this, too. Why not simply define yourself as not white, but 75% French and 25% Belgian? If white people today are going to take the blame for shit they didn't do on the grounds of ancestral guilt, why not just identify yourself out of whiteness? Fuck it. This is why, from a liberal perspective, we see progressives as being racist, sexist, homophobic, and so on, because their conception of bigotry inevitably leads to more bigotry. The progressive, in stripping away the immutable characteristic from the equation, becomes permissive of a whole bunch of terrible stuff that liberals correctly view as bigoted. Their only way out is to double down on their bigotry or fall back to our position once they can no longer stand lying.